I've been around through the whole thing, and I know how long this process has taken, and time, effort, money, all of that. And so I know that you have a strong reason to be writing this book. And I just wondered if you could share what has been behind the creation of this book for you, and what do you hope the book will accomplish?
Okay. When we first started the book, it was a time when we realized so many people were really suffering terribly. It was the beginning of the recession and the downturn. But what came out of it struck us as how desperate people were and terrified. We saw many people that didn't know how to cope with what was coming at them. And we saw them deteriorate or go to old coping mechanisms that didn't work anymore. And it was affecting their mental health, their emotional health, their families, their lives. I've never seen so many scared people at one time on such a massive level. I personally have been through this before. And thanks to that, I was able to draw on my old experiences to help me through it and help a lot of other people. The motivation for the book was to let people know that there was hope, and that there was help, and there was healing available to them. But we first had to help them identify that these were considered traumatic times. And when we think about trauma, we always think about the shock type of trauma, and I think most people think that. But they don't realize that there's another kind of trauma that's called developmental trauma. And for many reasons, that came into play during that time of, I think it was 2007, 2008, was the beginning of the real hard times with the recession. We personally were hit in our business, in our personal life, so it really struck home and how destructive it could be. We also needed to give people some ammunition to protect themselves. It was also a time where a lot of opportunism and attacks were coming at people who were very vulnerable. And were so scared they didn't know where to turn. And we had to help them begin to understand the situation, understand their reactions to it, understand that it could also trigger old fearful experiences from their past, which we call developmental trauma, and that the combination of both is devastating on their emotions, their psychology, their spirit, their bodies, and we were seeing it all over the place. So I decided that the book would be a good way to approach more people and to reach out to more people and to make them aware of what was happening to themselves, not just socially and community-wise, but what was happening that they couldn't get a handle on. They were so scared and overwhelmed. So we wanted to give them an understanding and a clarification and some help. And this book was a way for us to do it. And I think it's a good book. We also talk in that book about the skills and techniques that I've developed over the last 40 years that we've used for different kinds of trauma that I've used for a long time. And now we've applied it to more current situations, military issues, military families as well. So we wanted to bring it up to date, and we've learned an awful lot even since then. So it seemed very applicable. So we talk about that in the book too, that there's hope, there's relief from pain, there is healing available, and there's, we call it reinventing, that there's a new way to learn to cope. Once you realize the old ways don't work anymore. And it gives them a leg up, and it encourages them to move ahead and redesign their lives in the present and deal with the present situation and not be so terrified and hopeless and despairing, and also to be victims of a lot of deceptions that have been going on too, as far as people being played on for money, and it scares them. So we wanted to help them with that too, because it made them physically ill. We saw that. Emotionally, they were really vulnerable and unprepared. We saw a lot of damage. We still do. It's not over. So this book is very timely. It's for the present. And I hope it really helps a lot of people. That was we did not want this thrust of this book to be just for the professional community. We can write another book for that. We wanted this to get out to where the need really is in the communities, and talk to people where the need really is. So it was written like that. It was written for those folks. And I hope it speaks to a lot of people in need, that they can understand it, relate to it, and know that we're here for them, and there is help for them.
Do you think people understand what trauma is? Or do you think sometimes people see it as something that follows a really, like you mentioned, a shock? But isn't trauma kind of a broader thing? How would you describe trauma, just in basic terms, for somebody who maybe doesn't quite understand what it is?
It's a good question, and I thought I knew when we wrote that book that everybody knows what trauma is, because that's the world I work in, that's my calling, and that's what I'm immersed in all the time. And people don't know what trauma is. Their thinking is, well, the soldiers in the wars know trauma, or something really dramatic and shocking is traumatic, which is all true. It's a different kind of trauma, and it's very true. But they never understood how wide a path that trauma can take. And so many people I spoke with, even though they were feeling incredible distress and were being traumatized and also re-engaging old traumas, didn't know that was trauma. And when I talked to them about it, well, that's for other people. What's that got to do with me? And I'd have to explain to them, it's an epidemic that is widespread, and especially in our country in the last 4 or 5 years. But I've known about it for the last 40. We didn't call it developmental trauma then. I knew what it was, and how it affects people, but I explained to them, if they've had difficult childhoods, if things happened to them early in their life and they developed ways to cope and live through it, that left its wounds and that left its scars. That's called developmental trauma. And yes, many people have that. But that combined with shock trauma or more current traumas is the most lethal combinations. So I explain it to them, and all of a sudden they get, oh my God, that's me. But before that, they don't see that. They didn't know it was that. They didn't know what to call it. They didn't understand it. And they tried to almost exclude themselves from that, because it almost made them face how difficult and distressing their life situation had become. So once we talk about it, it also means they have to face the truth about what's going on. And that's very hard. People have a hard time with that. On a personal basis, they engage me all over the community and will tell me about their lives. And I know it's trauma. They don't know that. So when you tell them that, at first it's hard for them to admit. But once they get it, it gives them a new path. And I can encourage them and show them that there are ways to deal with this. But you first got to know the damage is done, or that the old mechanisms that they're relying on, they're repeating over and over again, that used to work, do not work anymore. And they're kind of stuck. So we have to get them unstuck. We have to help them reinvent. We also have to help them deal with their physical issues as well that have been affected by early trauma. So we have to educate them a little bit about what this does to the reflexes, the nervous system, the autonomic or automatic responses, and how that gets triggered. We call it triggering. The initial response isn't going to be an intellectual one. It's going to be a visceral, overwhelmingly physiological reaction, and they're going to go into an alert reaction to protect themselves that may have worked in the early time of their lives. The frustration they feel and the fear, it doesn't many times apply to what's happening today. And that's where they get stuck. And that really scares them, because they don't know what to do. So they get helpless and hopeless. And some people go into complete terrified paralysis, and they just want to give up and get overwhelmed and stop. And in these times, you can't do that. You have to go into action. You have to engage the situation, see it for what it is, and deal with it, and not become a victim of it. So we're a great endorser of people not being victimized by these times and the traumas in their life. And we have to help them. And our work in the book, as we describe it, does help them through it in a very thorough way.
Your
yeah.
subtitle mentions
Yeah.
that trauma is a hidden epidemic, and what did you mean by that?
Well, I think what we're talking about has how extensive trauma is and how it affects so many people and so many families. When I say it's hidden, I think people go through it, but they don't know what it is. And they don't know where to turn many times. What we see is it has become so pervasive now, more than I've ever seen it before. We realize it's so widespread, and we see it in so many dimensions to our lives today. The financial, economic crisis, people losing their homes, their jobs, being in trouble with the banks and debt collectors, people who've never had that before. But what I see more, and we also see the veterans coming back, soldiers coming back and their families. To me, it's very widespread, and that's going to be a big challenge to our communities, that this is coming back, and the effects of trauma need to be known so we can be sensitive in how to help people, how to help our soldiers and their families, who I feel really have been selfless and courageous and given up an awful lot. But they're not going to come back in good shape, and we have to recognize that and be available and sensitive to what they're going through. Sometimes it's hard to understand and relate to. Once you're touched by it, you'll never be the same again. Just a neighbor, a family member. Once you're touched, you'll get it. Until that time, it may seem foreign to you. The other aspect of it is I have never seen more people almost in shock about how things have hit them. We've seen it clinically, of course, for people who've come to us for many, many years. And my avenue and my calling in my life has been to help people with very serious traumatic backgrounds that's affected their lives in ways that they can't seem to shake. They keep reenacting it. It may have happened in the past, but they keep doing it in the present. It's almost like a moth attracted to a flame. They can't stop themselves from these destructive behaviors. So they keep doing these reenactments. We feel that it's more pervasive than ever. So we deal with it clinically, we deal with it in the community. But many, many people are suffering now. Many. So I do, and I call it hidden. I should say it's they don't understand or know the extent of it, or what it actually is. So we call it the hidden epidemic. I do feel it's an epidemic, though. And it is affecting people's physical health. Enough years and intensity of distress will break down their physical health, which we're seeing a lot of today. So that's why we call it the hidden epidemic. People don't understand what it is. We're going to bring it out in the open, talk about it openly, help people, the everyday person, relate to what's going on, and give them hope and encouragement and an avenue to get some help. That's what we want to do for them.
So this book is, you said it's more for people who, just the regular people who might be experiencing it, and also that it could be for someone who thinks they may have gone through trauma, or if they have someone they care about or know of who might have gone through some, or if you just want to kind of understand what might be happening with the veterans coming back.
Yes.
The book is for a wide variety of people, is that?
As I was talking, you're just following my train of thought, many people have come up to us after something tragic has happened, from a person suffering from trauma for a long time, and no one recognized what was happening until it was too late. And we've had people come up to us and go, this is what's happened. If we would have known, we could have saved his life. Like, what were the signs? What should we have looked for? Where should we have encouraged them to go? We would have done something. And now we're just completely overwhelmed and devastated because somebody who cared about and loved is gone. And if we would have known and been able to recognize the signs, we would have wanted to do something if we could. This book is going to help folks recognize the undermining and destructive effects of trauma and be able to help others and come alongside them and direct them in a way that will get them the help they need as much as they can, but they won't have to feel so at a loss and then feel such regret that they didn't know after the facts. This book will educate them and help them And all I have to do is pick it up, and there's chapters right on what to look for. What are the classic signs? And over a period of time, how it begins to evolve, and what can be done. So we hope this book will help many people.
And from what you said so far, it sounds like you've had both professional experience with trauma and personal experience with trauma. And you've mentioned over 40 years. And it sounds like you're an expert. And could you just kind of tell us your experiences, professional and personal, that have brought you to where you are today and knowing what you know?
Yeah. Well, it starts personally. Before I was a psychotherapist and entered the field, I had another life. And it had nothing to do with psychotherapy or helping other people. It was a different walk of life, and not a good one. And it was filled with trauma from my childhood all the way to the time that I made a change to start my life over again and move into the helping professions. But it was a hard life, and I've had plenty of developmental trauma in my own life. The way I lived, everybody just accepted that's a way of life, a hard way of life. Growing up on the streets, growing up in a hard community, growing up where there was a lot of corruption, and it was just a way of life. And to me, that's the way I saw life. I grew up on the streets, I grew up in communities where organized crime and decent people all lived together, we grew up together. We just almost accepted it as just part of life, and it isn't. And it wasn't a good way of life, and ultimately I was affected by it and became a victim of it. I also was a fighter and a survivor from that kind of life, which helped me in some ways, and in other ways didn't make me the most sensitive person in the world, until my own victimization from it devastated my family, myself, and everything in my life, and it changed me, and it began to mold me in a new direction, and that was it gave me a new compassion for people who suffer and who are in pain or are victimized. I decided to follow a career in that new direction, and that's how I got to where I am. The depth and pursuit within the psychotherapy profession and the clinical side, that was important to me to really, it had to be honest, it had to go where the real problems were, and it had to be real, because it was something that had to heal me as well. And I wasn't a person that could just be impressed with a lot of words after a while. It really had to work and turn people's lives around and get to the core of where the problems were. So I chose an avenue of education. It was a little circuitous because I had to find my way, but it was a more in-depth kind of psychotherapy that dealt with the distortions from trauma in the body and the nervous system, the unconscious, and I wanted to apply it in very down-to-earth ways, and not just appeal to the sophisticated or the intellectual, which I never was. So it had to be able to speak to me, and I learned to simplify very complicated approaches and develop them, and I've been doing it for the last 42 years, and it works, and we're continuing to grow and change and learn new things all the time. We've incorporated new approaches that I didn't know 12 years ago, 13 years ago. But my journey to learn is to improve the effectiveness of healing people who've been extremely devastated and traumatized. That's been my life's work. And it comes from where I started. And it talks from I talk from my heart and my experience and my own healing. I have the scars, but I don't walk around like a wounded beast anymore. But at one time I did. So I know it can be healed. And to apply it to things today seems so relevant and important and widespread. So I'm really grateful to what we have and what we're doing. And this book is another avenue of speaking to people where their hurt is and showing them that they can do actually better when they work through trauma. They'll become people they never knew they would be, and we want that.
I wanted to ask whether, sometimes people say time heals wounds, or just, I don't want to stir that up again. I finally have kind of got that settled down. I don't want to look at it again. Is that really true? Can trauma heal itself just over time?
Not
Just
most.
to look at it?
No, my experience is most of the time it gets suppressed and contained. Today, I think another epidemic is the use of pharmaceuticals to contain the impact of trauma. That containment is actually causing problems over the long run for us because it's not really getting to the core of what happened in the first place. We have to deal with that. We need to access that energy and that experience so we can mobilize people through it and help them. And the drugs are actually, not always, but many times they create a lot of barriers for the person. And we try to soften that up and bring it out in a way that can work with it. Okay, well you're asking me if time heals all wounds. That's an old wives' tale, and that is not what we see most of the time. There's degrees of trauma, and some of them, of course, heal. But when we're talking about the more complex and difficult traumas, it is absolutely not true. In fact, they get worse. Because what happens is that they're held in and contained, and they actually build on themselves with intensity. So they get worse because they're not being dealt with. And eventually, when we tap them out, they're much worse than we would have gotten to them earlier. We could have diffused it, we could have worked people through it, and they could have healed a lot better. But when it's held in for a long time, it creates much more damage. And I hear that all the time. And I was told the same thing. That's not what we see at all. And when people come in and they're in shock at something that happened 5 or 10 years ago, all of a sudden out of the blue, they're having these incredible emotional and physical reactions. And it's overwhelming and debilitating and terrifying. The first thing they say, but this happened 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Why is it hitting me now? And then I ask them, well, tell me what you did about it. Well, when it was over, it was over. I wanted to get on with my life and put it behind me and get on with things. I didn't want to be there and indulge it. I wanted to get away from it. It's understandable from a human perspective. It's from a treatment perspective and a healing perspective. It's not a good thing at all. It's better the quicker you get to it and get help with it, the better the healing is, and the shorter the time for healing. The longer it's there, the more difficult the process of healing it is, and we're dealing with an accumulation of material that never got dealt with, and over time it just seems to be developing into a hurricane. And once it explodes and comes out one way or another, it feels like a hurricane or a tornado is just taking you over. And it's terrifying when that happens. You probably read about it more about soldiers coming back that have post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury. That's the most publicized information about the long-term effects of trauma. And they too, particularly with their mentality of being tough and being able to tough it out, and then they're home for 5 years, 6 years, and they'll all of a sudden be sitting in a bedroom one day and all of a sudden they can't move, and they begin to break out in a sweat, and they just begin to cry, and they can't move, and they're staring at a wall, petrified, and they realize they're reliving some war episode of losing buddies or being under attack or whatever, and now it's hitting. They've gone on with their lives, their families, their work, and all of a sudden people around them are in shock because they see these very stable individuals who they love, who all of a sudden are absolute disaster. So we know that time does not necessarily heal trauma. It makes it worse. That's one of the other things that make it a hidden epidemic. People bury it, and they feel if they put time between the experience and go on with their lives, that's going to make it go away. But what's hidden about it is the long-term effects and the entanglements that eventually come out are brutal. And their approach, which many of us have heard, didn't work. So that hidden material that's been contained and suppressed it just overwhelms them and blows them out of the water. And it's out of context with their present life. So they're actually caught in a time warp. They're reliving their past. They're not in the present, but it absolutely is affecting their present day. So that's what we see. And we think it's critical, and it is a hidden epidemic. And it's coming up for some reason more than I've ever seen before.
You've mentioned some kind of dramatic emotional reactions, like with soldiers and with other people, that people can really see, yeah, there's really something going on here, there's a problem. And you've also mentioned that as you meet people, as you work with people, you see the signs of trauma.
Yeah.
What are some of the maybe a little more subtle ones, or what are the things you see that clue you in that there's a presence of some lasting effects of trauma? What, I mean, if you want to call them symptoms, or, you know, what are people struggling with that they might not attribute to trauma?
Yeah. A lot of times people have physical problems that they think are strictly medical. And when we look at them more carefully, there's a level of stress that they haven't wanted to deal with that ultimately will manifest itself physically. So we look at that. We've seen some very serious, we've treated many cases. One that stands out in our mind that we've learned a lot from was an MS patient who had been raped and beaten repeatedly, and that triggered an MS attack down the line. And so what we were dealing with were the long-term effects, destructive effects of MS, but the trauma that was involved in it, that triggered it all, was from the rapes and the beating and the abuse. And to her dying day, we helped her for many years. Every time we treat her body, the old memories emotionally would come up that had affected a certain part of the body. So we learned a lot from that. Well, we've seen it in many ways. The other is addictions. Every time that we treat an addiction and you see someone who's got a drinking problem or a drug problem and an addiction to pharmaceuticals, there is always hidden epidemics of trauma someplace, and it's affected their mental health. So they self-medicate. This is the way they kind of contain the effects of their traumas. That's another one. There are so many, just in normal conversation. If a subject comes up and all of a sudden somebody has very strong reactions and they feel anger, and you can see it so out of context, but yet they're very angry, or their tears are coming to them, they're upset, and you look around what's going on in their life, or in the actual situation, there's nothing happening to bring up that emotion, and yet they're feeling it very intensively. That tells us there's trauma. They may not even remember the details, but their body is reacting. They've been triggered. Their nervous system is going into the reaction from the trauma. So we see it, and you'll see that plenty. You'll see it all around. I've experienced it many times. What other ways do we see it?
Do you see it in relationships?
A lot in relationships. A lot. A more dramatic example is someone who's had a lot of sexual trauma in their lives. Let's say incest or something terrible. They'll either become very promiscuous sexually later on. They'll either find a partner that will continue to abuse them and be completely distorted and perverted sexually, and they go into serial relationships, one person after another, and each one is destructive. Each one follows some pattern, and it started in the initial traumas. So we can see it in relationships. You can see it in troubled marriages. Many times, one of the partners in the relationship will feel they're being terribly criticized, and they'll react with such intensity. And we'll be sitting there and go, nobody's criticizing you. I'm just thinking, you have a man here who's very loving, and right now, he's being very sweet, but you're hearing it as criticism. Something's wrong. When we really find out, it's usually about earlier abuse or serious psychological or emotional, physical abuse, and yet here it's playing itself out in a loving relationship. So the relationship in the present begins to break down. A lot of confusion and complexity. Another one would be somebody who never had the love of a mother and finds a woman, instead of having a partner in life, they make the wife into the mother they never had. Vice versa, A woman that always loved her father, never had the father, he died, father was gone, abandoned her, or whatever, finds a man to be her father. And every interaction has that underlying inequity. In this case, the wife becomes the daughter, and the father is the father. The husband is the father. There's a distortion again of early developmental trauma. So we see it a lot in relationships. We see it with parenting in many ways. We see people that have abusive backgrounds can become abusers themselves, or because they've been abused, they will not even consider disciplining a child in the most normal terms because it triggers them with the association of how discipline was used as an excuse to abuse, and they were abused. So they become completely permissive and ineffective. So we see a lot of it in relationships. People that go into our profession, I don't know one that doesn't go into it to help other people because it's the help they need for the pain they suffered and nobody was there. So they want to help others. Through it, hopefully, we develop, get help for ourselves, and realize we can't save the world. And what we're doing, where we started, really isn't necessarily going to help others. But what it does do is point us in the right direction. And hopefully we can become better at what we're doing, and better people, and healed ourselves. So we find that. One other one, we find soldiers coming back. We treat a lot of them. And what we find is one of the key elements to their healing is to learn to help others and to give to others, particularly relating to war-related trauma. That's a very healing component to their treatment. So we're seeing all of these different implications related to trauma and the long-range effects, and how to treat it, how to recognize it, how to treat it, how to turn it around and heal it.
I was going to ask you if you believe there's a spiritual element to trauma.
Always. I don't mean religious though, but spiritual always. Anybody that's gone through trauma, true trauma, will realize they don't have control. There's something bigger, and there's something more powerful that seems to be in control at that point. It's almost a shock, and it's the time of the shock and the actual trauma that's taking place that you're getting this very powerful awareness that there's something else in charge. There's someone else that's calling the shots. And it just blows our illusion of being in control of our lives out of the water. Because at those moments, the only thing we can do is survive and live through it and hope that we get through it okay, and our loved ones get through it okay. But there's always a spiritual awareness. The long-term effects of it aren't always good, because people can get very angry if they believe in God. They'll blame God. How could you let this happen? That's very common. We see that a lot. People who have never known anything about a relationship with God all of a sudden decide to follow that up because it awakens them that they're not in control. There's something much more in control, and that they need to find that caring relationship.